the tension, the challenge for these exiles and for we exiles, because 1 Peter reminds us in chapter 2 and verse 11, I urge you as strangers and aliens in the world. How do you live in a foreign land, in a godless culture that's becoming more godless every day? How do you live in a godless culture and still retain your identity as the people of God? Granted, it would be very hard for God's people, as we shall see, in order to keep their identity locked and loaded on the Lord. It was a huge challenge in order to retain their distinctive monotheistic worship to God, especially when there was no temple. They had lost again their monarchy, their land, their temple. These were all very dear to them. But Jeremiah, don't miss this, was painting a vivid picture of a brand new theological idea that was so necessary for those exiles, and I believe needs to be restored amongst God's people today, that God is bigger than the temple, that God is bigger than Jerusalem, that God is bigger than Israel, that God dwells even in Babylon. And he dwells in Kalamazoo. The exiles were encouraged to engage culture, not to run away from culture. They were encouraged to build houses, have babies, and to start businesses and take care of one another and influence the culture. And our theme verse, to build, to plant, to marry, to multiply, and to seek the welfare of the city. For in its welfare you will find your own welfare. Now this strategy is clearly an offensive strategy, not defensive. It's clearly hopeful and strategic, and I believe it has much to say to each of us even today. And I hope that over these weeks you will find your place within this vision. But before we roll up our sleeves and get after kind of the nitty-gritty of unpacking the vision, what do we actually do, I want to spend our remaining minutes paying attention to how do we think accurately about what God is calling us to do. Because without proper thinking, our actions will, over time, get off track. So right thinking is so important. The exiles had to unlearn. This is so hard. They had to unlearn what they had learned from their parents and from their grandparents and from their great-grandparents. They had to unlearn what they had done since they were children, that you came to the temple in order to experience God. And they had to unlearn that practice because there was no temple available to them in Babylon. And I believe that a similar renaissance is desperately needed, not only in this congregation, but in the North American church at large. For decades and for centuries, American pastors have been trying to build the church. Oftentimes, this has become an idolatrous pastime, almost blind to the fact that Jesus never told us to build the church. He actually said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against my church. Your job is to multiply disciples. And all the while, North American pastors have been tinkering with and modifying and posturing to try to build the church. All the while, culture in America has become increasingly disinterested in coming to church. And so if anyone's to blame in that scenario, it's way easier to throw the blame on culture and say that if America wasn't falling away from its Christian heritage, churches would be packed full of people. But the more important question is to ask, who's responsible for the culture? Do you actually expect that someone who doesn't know God would be able to make the culture God-fearing? That makes no sense at all. None whatsoever. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but the responsibility for the culture being where it's at is on us. It's on Jesus' followers, not living up to our highest potential and being the salt and light that Jesus commanded and commissioned us to be. You see, when you're in exile, you can't have a temple-centric kind of faith. And for too long, Americans have thought about church as a noun, a building that we come to, rather than what it actually is. It's a verb of a people on mission. The mission of the church has to do with partnering with God and with His people in that mission. It's a mission about advancing the kingdom of God, not advancing the kingdom of the church. Jesus told us to pray, "Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven." He did not say, "Pray, thy church come on earth as it is in heaven." And though the church plays a critical and a crucial role, please don't miss this. Jesus said the church is His body. He said it's my bride. So the church is extraordinarily important. But the end game is not ultimately about the church, it's about the kingdom of God. Think of it this way. I was watching football last night, a couple of college games, and kind of getting into it as much as you can get into it when there's not as many people in the stands, and because against God's will, the Big Ten is not playing, and so we're having a prayer meeting right after church in order to pray for the Big Ten that they will come to their senses. Just kidding. But you know this much, even if you don't follow sport, you know that the huddle of gathering the players together before they run out to do the plays is exceptionally important. Or else you have dropped passes, you have linebackers running into one another, you have a chaos and a mess. So the huddle is super important. But you know this, the huddle is not the point of the game. And neither is the gathering of God's people the point of the game. We gather because we need to know the plays. We need to be encouraged. We need to do all the one another's one to another. So don't hear me say, stop coming to church. Not what I'm saying. All I am saying is that this is not the end of the game. This is just the beginning, where we huddle together and we gather our encouragement, and then we go out into a city, and that's where the game is played. Every day, where you live, where you work, where you play, that's the end of the end game. The purpose, the goal, the result is kingdom life, not the typical church-centered metrics. Jesus never said, go therefore and make church attenders. He didn't say that. He said, I have come that you might have life, and it's an abundant life. And that abundant life is in the kingdom of God. He did not say, I have come to make abundant church. And so, not only that, but Jesus will one day, I can't wait for this day, He's going to come back, make no mistake, and the groom will gather up the bride, and that will be a grand day. But that, my friends, is the conclusion of the church. The kingdom goes on forever and ever and ever. So really, the church, the bride of Jesus, is a temporary reality until what technically is known as the consummation. I'll say it again, the church is a verb. It's a way of living out in the community, out in the world. It is not a place where certain religious practices take place. And if COVID-19 has taught us anything, let it be this, that we are not a church that is focused on what happens in this building. That is not our impact. It's bearing much fruit out in the city, within our families, wherever we live. Why? Because the church is not a thing, it's a who. It's the people of God, wherever we work, wherever we live, wherever we play, all informed by our relationship with Jesus. And in a couple of weeks, we'll see how it's all fueled by the gospel, the power of the gospel. Here's another word picture that may be helpful to you. I find it helpful. When my relationship with Terry, is informed, everything I do or don't do in my marriage, there's a couple things, Chris, I don't do. I'm working on it. But everything I do and don't do in my marriage is informed by my relationship with Terry. I don't go home to be married. I bring my marriage with me wherever I go. That's what it means. And in a similar fashion, that's what church means. It's all of us, wherever we are, out in the city, out in the world, getting the work of God done in order to build the kingdom of God, as we incarnate in every aspect of our lives the visible presence of Jesus. This big idea holds the promise of engendering every one of us to live a big life, as together we endeavor to renew a city, all the while being renewed ourselves in order to restore a lost and broken world for God's glory. And as we shall see in these weeks, this assignment given to the exiles of Babylon very closely mimics exactly how Jesus taught and what Jesus modeled. A call to be a people of blessing, to live lives of generosity, to be people of sensitivity and of service, to be positive examples of joy in a toxic cancel culture where people desperately need to see that Jesus is real. So as you go out from here today, your very first assignment, if you don't know what else to do, is just start over loving people. Especially people who don't look like you, think like you, believe like you, vote like you. That's the person God really wants you to overlove in order to bring the kingdom of God right in that moment. Our vision is a grand and a bold declaration that we will not be paralyzed by a parochial vision of a church-centric vision, but rather we will release the people of God in order to be difference makers in this city and the world. To that end, I invite you to buckle up and be a part of this experience so that together we can reach Kalamazoo and eventually the world.